on December 3rd. According to the news from the Ministry of Commerce of China, the Chinese government decided to strengthen the export control of relevant dual-use items to the United States. In principle, the export of dual-use items related to gallium, germanium, antimony, and super hard materials to the United States will not be permitted. For the export of dual-use items of graphite to the United States, a more stringent review of the end-user and end-use will be implemented. This is a countermeasure against the United States, because on December 2nd, the U.S. side included 140 Chinese semiconductor enterprises in the entity list. Many chip enterprises including Aura and Xi and Kailai were listed as prohibited export objects by the United States. In fact, this is not the first time that the Ministry of Commerce has restricted the export of materials, such as gallium and germanium. As early as last July, China first implemented export control on gallium and germanium. As the largest producer and exporter of gallium and germanium in the world, China's export control will inevitably have a certain effect. How significant is the effect? The U.S. side actually produced a 76-page report in October this year to conduct an assessment. This report was prepared by experts from the United States Geological Survey (USGS). They designed a quantitative model, which analyzes the impact of supply disruptions on GDP and industrial output through input-output tables and nonlinear optimization methods. The model simulates global price changes, supply reductions under different levels of export restrictions, and the knock-on effects of these changes on key industries in the United States. Finally, the report pointed out that China's export restrictions may lead to a reduction of $3.4 billion US in US GDP, $3.1 billion US for gallium, and $400 million US for germanium, among which the semiconductor manufacturing industry is the most significantly affected. The supply chains of gallium and germanium are actually highly concentrated, like putting all eggs in one basket. More than 90% of the world's gallium and germanium are produced in China. This means that other countries rely almost entirely on China's supply. If China reduces exports, it will be very difficult for other countries to find alternative sources in the short term, because these metals are not as widely available as copper and iron. There is a particularity in the production of gallium and germanium. They are byproducts, extracted during the processing of other metals. Gallium is generally a product of electrolytic aluminum production, while germanium is an adjunct of lignite mining. Both of these production methods are relatively polluting. Therefore, it is rather difficult for European and American countries to develop a production line on their own, and both the direct investment and the treatment cost are very high. In terms of market demand, these two metals have very specialized uses. The most common use of gallium is as a semiconductor material, such as in mobile phone chips, high-efficiency solar cells, and LED lights. Germanium is mainly used in optical fiber communication, telecommunication equipment, infrared optical lenses, and other fields, and even in military equipment. There are some substitutes. For example, silicon can partly replace gallium, but its performance is inferior to that of gallium, and the efficiency will be reduced. So once the supply is interrupted, it is not easy to replace more. At rubles only, the gallium and germanium markets are small, but affect the big picture of the high-tech industry. Coupled with the low transparency of trade data and low market elasticity, price changes will be particularly sensitive. It is like a small wooden stick that supports the entire high-tech machine. Once there is a problem, the impact will be great. To figure out the impact of China's restriction on the export of gallium and germanium on the U.S. economy, this report used a mathematical model. Like playing SimCity. Trying to predict what will happen in different situations, their model mainly starts from the input-output table, which is like a flowchart of economic activities, showing the relationships between various industries. For example, how much gallium and germanium the semiconductor industry needs to produce chips, and which industries will use these chips. Then, they use an optimization tool to try to simulate how various industries adjust when the supply of gallium and germanium is reduced, such as reducing production or increasing prices. The core data of the model comes from 2021, including the global production, inventory and trade data of gallium and germanium. They assume that the reduction of China's exports will directly affect the global supply, and then calculate the specific impact on the United States according to the proportion of the U.S. market. In addition, they also assume that the market demand will not change suddenly in the short term and the industries can only adapt passively. Although this method cannot fully reflect the complex situations in reality, it can quickly give the results of the most likely occurrence. This calculation method helps them estimate the possible loss of GDP in the U.S. economy and the main affected industries after the supply reduction. Let's look at the conclusions of this report first of all. The report analyzed what would happen if China completely stopped exporting gallium and germanium. The impact of gallium is particularly large because it is an important material in the semiconductor industry. The model shows that the global supply of gallium will be reduced by 39.5%, and the price will soar by 2.5 times, while the reduction in germanium supply is only 5.5% and the price increase is relatively small, about 26%. This indicates that gallium has a more serious impact on the global market than germanium, because other countries almost have no sufficient inventory or production capacity to fill the gap. This is because other countries have no ability to refine gallium at all except China. The research also calculated the impact of supply reduction on the overall U.S. economy. If China completely stops the export of gallium, the U.S. GDP is expected to be reduced by $3.1 billion, accounting for 0.013% of the GDP in 2021. The impact of the interruption of germanium export is much smaller, with a predicted reduction of $400 million. If both gallium and germanium are interrupted, the total loss of U.S. GDP is about $3.4 billion. The report specifically analyzed the specific affected industries. The main user of gallium is the semiconductor manufacturing industry, which accounts for 46.5% of the total reduction of U.S. GDP. In addition, there are also circuit board assembly, automotive electronic equipment and computer manufacturing industries that are indirectly affected. The impact of germanium is more dispersed. Industries such as fiber optic cable manufacturing, optical instruments, and infrared equipment will all be affected. Although these industries do not contribute as much to GDP as the semiconductor industry, their special uses make germanium indispensable, such as in telecommunication and military equipment. To gain a more comprehensive understanding of the risks, the report also conducted analyses of different scenarios, including two extreme cases of high impact and low impact. In the worst-case scenario, the reduction in gallium supply could lead to a loss of up to $8.2 billion in U.S. GDP, and germanium could lead to a loss of $1.1 billion. In the most optimistic scenario, these two figures are $1.7 billion and $1 million respectively. This difference depends on many factors, such as how large the global inventory is, whether the production capacity of other countries can be quickly supplemented, and the sensitivity of industries to material prices. Although the model of the report mainly analyzed the short-term, about 1-year economic impact, it also mentioned that, in the long term, Supply disruptions may prompt some industries to adopt alternative strategies, such as developing new materials or finding other supply sources. These changes may partially relieve the short-term shock, but they require time and capital investment therefore. In the short term, the production chain of the U.S. high-tech industry is still very fragile. The report recommends that the United States increase its strategic reserves of gallium and germanium, mainly to deal with sudden situations such as China's export restrictions specifically. The U.S. government can learn from Japan and establish a specialized mineral reserve agency, regularly purchase gallium and germanium, and store them in strategic reserve bases. At the same time, these reserves can be allocated according to the importance of industries, giving priority to ensuring the production needs of key industries such as semiconductors and optical fiber communications. Although storing minerals will increase some costs, compared with the economic losses caused by supply chain disruptions, this money is well spent currently. The United States almost completely depends on China for the production of gallium and germanium. To change this situation, the report recommends using policy incentives to increase the production capacity of the United States or its allies. How to do it? First, the government can provide subsidies to mining companies to reduce the cost of enterprises in mining and producing gallium and germanium. Second, tax incentives can be introduced to enable these companies to have more funds for technological research and development, such as improving the recovery rate of gallium and germanium or developing processes for extracting gallium and germanium from other minerals. At the same time, the United States can also cooperate with resource-rich allies such as Canada and Australia to help these countries increase production capacity and diversify the supply chain. In this way, even if China reduces exports, the United States has a plan B to ensure supply and will not be choked. It can be said that this report is a kind of cautious pessimism. It clearly points out the seriousness of the problem, but also admits that through reserves, industrial policies and supply chain diversification, the United States can gradually reduce risks. If China really restricts exports, the United States will face short-term pain, but it is hoped that it can gradually restore balance through adjustments.